Today on the Sound of Ages podcast, we launch video. We'll see how it goes. When it's a one-man crew, it's a little sketchy, if you know what I mean. Today, we're going to sit down with Andrew Maxfield once again for the next episode in our Wind, Water, Stone series, where we take a deep dive into track number 2, Oriens. Is a harmonization / recomposition using original chant melody from Oriens, and we'll take a deep dive into it. So sit back, buckle up. This is the Sound of Ages podcast.
She would keep sticks, so I was content. She would keep sticks, but where she
Thus doth we have one Sir Andrew Maxfield, here to talk about Oriens.
Oh boy, here I am.
Yep. Welcome back to Sound of Ages podcast. We today are talking about the second track on our Wind, Water, Stone album, Oriens. This is part of our reimagining kind of set, I guess, for lack of a better word. They're not really coupled together or set together on the album, but Drew and I had this idea that Drew would write some reimaginings of some Renaissance works, excuse me, and put this new spin on them. And so Oriens is one of those, and the one that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, dude.
Drew, help us start in.
Well, I think we have a theme through all of our collaborations, which is putting something that's old with something new. Sometimes that's programming, just like an old piece side by side with a new piece. But frequently it's kind of connecting those dots within single works. And so on the Wind, Water, Stone album, if you zoom way out, you could say that in general, there's kind of a connection between old counterpoint and new harmony. That's a theme. But then if you zoom in a little bit, then you could look at O Oriens and you could look at If You Love Me and say, ooh, these are kind of a new recontextualization or recasting or something like that of old source material. And that's kind of old news in the compositional world. Everybody likes to look backward in order to figure out how to move forward. And if you think about grabbing bits of plain chant, it could be the Dies Irae, and it shows up in all sorts of compositions, whether it's Berlioz or wherever else. It's kind of an old game that composers play, which is kind of hanging their hat on existing material or adding like a little link to a chain that stretches way back. And I like that frame of reference. In fact, if you go back, to the Renaissance, there wasn't really a word composer. There was just musician. And if you were the kind of person who made music, a craftsperson of the musical craft, what you did was you took what existed and you added a link to the chain. And there wasn't this kind of modernist obsession with being original or making something that nobody had ever heard before. I'm putting words in their mouths a little bit, but I think that's a true assessment. There was really just learn how the notes work, learn how patterns work, and then be a good little craftsperson. And that meant using a lot of inherited material, received material to make whatever it was you were going to make. And I don't think there was such a weird, again, kind of modernist attachment to intellectual property and this kind of stuff, right?
Right.
I think that these days in our compositional landscape, certainly in composer school, there's a total obsession, a blinding obsession with self-expression. and making things that nobody's ever heard before. And the only reason I say this is that when I auditioned at Juilliard for my master's program, I sat down with a well-known composer who was in an audition, who was kind of conducting this audition, and he was looking at my score, and I thought I'd be clever and um, ask him like, "Well, what are you looking for?" And he paused and he said, "Well, I just want to hear something I've never heard before." And it's so interesting to me that that was the basic screening function of the audition, and it puts this wild prize on quote unquote originality, whatever that actually means.
Or
And
ingenuity, or yeah,
yeah,
like real. You think about well, it's okay. Sorry to cut you off, but I'll let you keep going in a second. But I don't want to lose this thought. So it's like I think of it also when people talk about it in business of disruptive innovation, and everything has to be brand new, completely unrelated from what's before it, and then that's how you've said something new. But even something like Apple or composers who may like I can't even think of composers like Schoenberg, who you may think just on the surface, whoa, they said something so new, completely out of a vacuum. No one had said anything like it before them. And it's just not true. Like they're taking all of this history, they're saying something significantly new based on their depth of study down to what they perceive as the foundational principle of X. And so it's like, I like the comment of the more fundamental a thing is, the more things are connected to it. So it's like you take one strand down to Renaissance counterpoint, late medieval, early Renaissance modernity, and you follow that thread singularly up, and you can find your way to Schoenberg and innovations in certain areas, but the rest are very strongly anchored to the foundation of Western music as a whole. And so it's just interesting to me that is the perception, because then it shows that, oh man, you might have a little bit more homework to do if you
oh,
think that that's the goal. If that's what you're trying to do, you actually have more to study from behind the past, in the past, than trying to come up with something no one's ever done.
yeah. Well, I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about that, and maybe you can't avoid thinking about it if you're trying to compose,
Right.
um, because you want to say something that hasn't been said before. I think that's a reasonable goal, but
Yeah.
how you do that is worth thinking about, because I think the common wisdom is, you plop some kid down in a conservatory program and you say, go forth. Don't sound like anything that has come before you. No pressure. And
Yeah. It's like, I can't think of anything more paralyzing than that.
well, and it's just dumb.
Right.
It's just
Right, because
genuinely
it's a
dumb.
it's a paradox, right? The best composers are ones who have a very unique voice that are saying something new and original. But that paradox on the other side of it is like tons of history and study of what came before them.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
those two
Yeah.
things married together is what actually propels things forward. And so I like, as a conductor, I really enjoy exploring that paradox too, because uh, for whatever reason, being a ensemble that's like, let's just do new works, only new works, living composers, doesn't really interest me. And when Sound of Ages first started, we were going to be Renaissance only, and I wasn't going to do anything later than Mozart. And then I realized that that is not a good idea for me to do, because there are other groups who are already doing that, number one. And number two, Mozart is actually very different and hard to program with Thomas Tallis. So if you're going to have, and the market here is asking for different things. And I care way more about connecting with the audience and like real elevating, heart opening, connection forging experiences. And so that's when I feel like, oh man, there's this cool ancient world that if we can find the thread to that foundation from today, we can take the audience with us, you know. And so
Sure.
that's why your works and our collaboration finding old and new, both as composer and conductor, has been so thrilling and fulfilling. And I think, like we mentioned last podcast, I think we've barely scratched the surface, you know.
Yeah.
There's infinite left to explore.
Yeah. Well, kind of connecting some of those dots, whereas I think it's kind of a tall order and a bad idea to tell some young composer, go forth, be original.
Hmm.
By contrast, I think it's good advice to say, um, go all the way to the bottom of the well. Like
Mm,
love your craft, love the history, and instead of trying not to sound like your influences, wrap your arms all the way around your influences and figure out what ignites you about those pieces or composers or what have you. And I think what happens is that if you respond with affection and interest to the tradition and to your influences, and you keep asking questions and answering them by practicing the craft, at some point on the long end of that, you might inadvertently say something in your own voice, and that's how you find your voice. Is it ensues. You don't really
mm,
pursue it directly. You pursue the craft, and you do it with love and curiosity and generosity, because that's the only thing that sustains a craft like this. And then on the far end, sort of as a leap of faith, something that happens to you eventually is that you figure out what your little tiny contribution might be. And I think the best goal for any composer is just to be a good and interesting link in the chain. And now that could be a really revolutionary link. You could really end up making something that nobody has ever heard before. And
right.
it could be radically different from what came before it. And you could be a standout in the sort of the textbook summary of music history or whatever. That's all fine. But I think that the way that you find your way there with integrity is loving the craft, loving the tradition, going all the way to the bottom of the well, and then continuing to ask questions about why you love what you love and what interests you, and responding to them with your own work. And I noticed in myself, for a long time, that for whatever reason, my ears perked up when I was listening to um, early music. Like, I'm way interested in what's going on in that music. And I think part of it is that it doesn't quite add up in tonal terms, in like common practice terms. And it just, you expect things to go right and they go left instead. It's just awesome that way.
Yeah.
And then for whatever reason, like my ears and my brain get a little sleepy, kind of early 1700s, mid 1700s, and I continue, and it's like, I'm sure I'd get bad grades for saying this in a music lit class or something like that, but I just get a little sleepy from there through the beginning of the 20th century. But man, like um, the minute that the common practice kind of starts cracking in the margins and people start asking fundamental questions again, like you were talking about, kind of getting down to the foundational stuff, then my ears light right back up. And so, as a person, for whatever reason, no good reason at all, I'm just drawn to the old and the new and trying to figure out what they have in common. And to me, what's interesting about that commonality, which I think points at some of our collaborations and maybe what Sound of Ages is for and what it does and all this, is that I think that before the common practice answer was sort of cemented in everybody's brains, people were still trying really hard to figure out what music was and how it worked.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
right, like it's not that the music is early that makes it interesting. It's that it's primal and it's exploratory. And
Yeah.
you had composers who were also, theoreticians who are writing these little treatises and all this kind of stuff, and you read them, and they're having big debates about what is consonant and what isn't. And
Right.
that's inherently interesting, right? Because it's like
Right.
pure math or particle physics or something like that. And then everything kind of gets answered and cemented in place by the time the Baroque is happening, and we have this kind of like templated answer for what the language is and how it works, which is basically that you have four note chords, but you only have three pitches in a triad, so you have to double something. And what gets doubled and why is the common practice. Like that is the answer.
Right.
And
And there's this hierarchical order of which chords, which harmonies in that particular scale set tend to be the most important down to the least important
yeah,
is kind of the next step on top of the doubling, I think, because when you think about a piece, a chant, let's say, or all that early quote unquote early music that's based on a final, and it doesn't really work that way because that was, the pure modes were only for monophony. Then you get into polyphony and it's like, well, it's still in this modal realm, but there's no like 4-5-1. It's just like, here's the final chord, but we can cadence kind of anywhere at any time, and you feel it going around, and you don't have this tritone pull the way that the common practitioners would have thought of it. And so it's like which notes to double and hierarchy of harmony, I guess, for lack of a better word, is really like what comes to my mind. And that
yeah,
it makes it so, what's the word? It's like, it's predictable, I guess, where there's formulaic, and it has this, even a deceptive cadence is like, ooh, deceptive cadence. How deceptive of you.
yeah, yeah. Well, formulaic, I think actually is the right word,
Right.
because what was being determined when they figured out a common practice for which note gets doubled and how the hierarchy works, what they were coming up with was the syntax or the formula of tonal
Right.
harmony, right? I mean, literally
Yeah.
formula. The one goes to the four goes to the five goes to the one, and all of the variations on that theme. And the thing is that like it's a beautiful formula, and there ain't nothing
Right.
wrong with that formula. And all the music that happened inside, it's like when they sort of said, we cracked it. This is how the tonal language works. There were so many composers that wrote exquisitely beautiful music using the language to do what that language can do. And
Yeah.
there's still an infinite number of things that you can do in that language. And I love, even when I was joking that I got a little sleepy, I love the music that's happening
Yeah.
as the common practice was clarifying, and then it became more colorful and inventive within its own parameters as you developed an increasingly chromatic and shifty way of using that same language. But I mean, the argument that I say all the time is that by the end of the 1800s, when you have Strauss and Mahler and these guys, like they basically max out the chromatic common practice language.
Right.
You can't use any more chromatic pitches than they used, and you can't fit any more players on the stage. So it's like,
Or even in the concert hall for that
yeah,
matter.
I, I mean, it's just so extra. It's just
Oh,
big,
extra.
big, big, biggity big, and you can't get any bigger. And
Yeah.
so somebody wakes up at the turn of the century, whether it's Debussy waking up or whether it's Schoenberg or Bartok I mean, we can go down the list, but everybody
Right.
wakes up saying, okay, so they used up all the notes. They used up all the players. What do we do now? And I
Yeah.
feel like that's a really important moment because they're asking themselves in a way the same things that their Renaissance ancestors were asking is like, what is this language? how does it
How does
work?
sound work? Yeah,
Yeah.
right. How does sound even function?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so, it's because you could even take that to this is not to disparage. Again, we joke and we tease, but I love Mozart. I just love Mozart, man. There's some of his choral stuff that I could just do all the time. But it and
Absolutely.
so it's and the formula is beautiful, and I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me as a non-aficionado of jazz that
Hmm.
jazz is a hyper extension of in terms of its harmonic progressions. You have a lot of common practice inspired harmonic things, right? Like five
Oh yeah,
one is
yeah,
still a
yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
jazz thing, right?
Well, here's the thing is like I really am fascinated by that early 20th century kind of fissure, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
have political orders that are collapsing and you have harmonic orders that are collapsing all at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you look at these various answers of how do you say something after Strauss and Mahler used up all the notes and all the players, you get different answers. So
Yeah.
like you have
Yeah.
a WC answer, which is like, well, let's keep the basic material of the language, but let's mix up the syntax. Let's loosen the syntax. You have a Schoenberg
Mm,
answer, which is like, well, let's keep the individual pitches, but let's completely do away with the syntax. Let's do away with the, third based harmony and see if we can create meaning and coherence without those parameters. And of course, he was, you know, a master scholar in Beethoven and
right.
really
Right.
understood the common practice. But he had an interest in saying like, could we create something coherent without it? And I think Bartok is another interesting response where you say, how do we make meaning without doing it exactly the way that the guys that came just before us did? But then jazz actually is another really important answer to that question because um, you have the basic parameters of common practice syntax, no question. Um, but you have a tension-rich and
Mm,
highly chromatic decoration, and then and then you have harmonic substitutions that start
right.
taking the where you have one sonority taking the place of another. And then before too long, it gets harder and harder to spot the underlying common practice template. And I think you
Right.
can argue that it's almost always there under the surface, but it gets a little farther and farther under the surface. Um,
Yeah.
but it's a player's language, it's an improviser's
Right.
language, and academia always runs the risk of turning it into a historical artifact, but it is, I think it's one of the most interesting responses to the collapse of the common
Yeah.
practice tonal language. And so for whatever reason, if we take this sort of like we're doing the Artemis thing here where we've like looped around the moon and now we're on our way back. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
if we use that as like the long return towards the Oriens track 2 on Wind, Water, Stone, it's inherently interesting to me to say like, well, okay, so I feel like what we think of as like modern music at the dawn of the 20th century, what does it have in common with early music? Well, I think they're asking foundational questions about how sound works, about how do we create coherence, if we're not leaning hard onto the prefabricated answers of common practice harmony, what is consonant? What is dissonant? Why do we perceive things as consonants and dissonance? How does tension and release work? And I think what they have in common are these kind of like primal questions
Yeah.
and primal interests. And I'm not, I mean, my setting of Oriens, I don't think of it as particularly harmonically adventurous or whatever, but it's just me exploring those questions and saying like, you know, can modal chant have something in common with modal jazz?
Right.
And can you what are the intersections and how do you explore them? And that's where this stuff comes from.
Yeah. So we open with just a straight quote from the chant itself.
Yep.
And then
Hmm.
it melts from there, and we hear it then kind of cascade, have this little echo, and then we hear Anthony or countertenor sing it in a free verse kind of chant, free rhythm type rhythm.
Hmm.
Um, then it moves on. We have another little echo, and then I love whenever you start to explore the idea of Faubourg and all things therefore adjacent to it
Mm. Mm.
is some of my favorite stuff. Anytime we get to those moments that you write in any of your pieces, they're always some of my favorite moments because I love that ancient Faubourg sound. And I love that sound when it appears in contemporary choral music. I love when you hear it in gospel. Again, that's not Faubourg. I should say three-part parallel planing harmonies. I love it
Yeah.
in Debussy, Impressionism. I love it in gospel music. I love it in Appalachian bluegrass. I love it in true Faubourg from Renaissance, and I love it in jazz. Right, you think about the horn section.
Yeah.
There's something about it that is just so captivating to me, especially when you have solitary tones underneath it, pedal tones, whatever. And so we get to, you know, partway through the score and we have this three-part little moment of the chant now in a faux Faubourg kind of way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and it's just thrilling.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing to point out because um, when, in music school, when people slog their way through harmony, um, or really theory,
Yeah.
there's this priority given to teaching four-part chorale style voicing
Mm,
and this constant vertical reduction into knowable Roman numeral chords. And
yeah.
and you get these like weird things cemented in your brain, like, well, all things being equal, contrary motion is good, and limited, close connection between neighboring tones in a single voice is good because that creates a sense of connection. All this kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
we very rarely ask ourselves questions like, what is thrilling?
Mm,
What is
man.
beautiful?
Right. Right. Because literally, and at that time, contrary motion, whatever the things you just said, is was beautiful at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
And we can appreciate it and it has its own beauty today, but it's not the only beautiful.
Right. And I feel like in music school, we do this funny thing where we basically drop in at the beginning of the common practice period, sort of like it's a done deal and a fait accompli. And we're like, well, there are four voices. They are soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And here are the rules of voice leading. Go forth and don't do anything wrong. And it's just not very, I'm not even
Right.
sure it's analytically all that useful. I mean, maybe it is.
Right.
And listen, I mean, I'm grateful that I can, analyze a hymnal and reduce things to the underlying, you know, tonal syntax. That is useful,
Yeah.
but very rarely, like in all of the theory classes that I had in harmony classes, nobody said, what would make this sparkle and shimmer, and why would people notice themselves leaning forward on their chairs and catching their
Mm,
breath? And I feel like
yeah.
the what I really want is I want a theory of beauty. And I don't, maybe that's just not classroom stuff to begin with. Maybe that's,
Right.
college isn't made for that. What do I know? But the when you bring up the horn section or the sax section in a jazz band, or the tight three-part harmony in Appalachian music or in bluegrass. There's something thrilling. There's something groovy, right?
Yeah.
And part of what that is that what we're getting is parallel motion, and we're getting a sense of a thick line. And
Mm.
in psychology, there's this notion of boundary salience where we notice the edges of things more than we notice the middle of things.
Hmm.
And so in harmony, I mean, we know this already, even in college harmony classes, because we know that the soprano is going to stick out. It has this kind of melodic predominance, and we know the bass is going to stick out. And you can kind of spot a good bass line when you see one on the page because of how it grounds the harmony. It's doing a good job being a boundary player, right?
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
notice the top and the bottom, and then the conventional wisdom is sort of like do no harm to your tenors and altos and just let them kind of float somewhere useful. And
Yeah.
but and if each of those four voices, SATB, are lines, what we lose then very frequently is the notion of the relative thinness or thickness of a line.
Mm.
Because if you take four voices and they're each doing their own thing totally independently, great counterpoint, yada, 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 perfect polyphony or whatever, you might say that that's kind of like four thin ballpoint pen lines being dragged across a page simultaneously.
Mm.
And that's especially true if you have one voice per part. You're very aware of each one of those lines doing its thing.
Yeah.
But uh, but in a way, they're all very similar to each other because each one has that same tip of the pen.
Right.
Whereas if you have some ballpoint pens and then you take a paintbrush loaded with magenta paint right through the middle of those same lines, and it has this like big, fat, splashy, squishy kind of quality to it, and you're like, wait a minute, that stands out.
One
That
of these
is
things
beautiful.
is not the same as the others.
Right.
To put a
And
variance on a famous phrase there.
from the wisdom of the Sesame Street. Um,
Yes, living on the street. The street.
you
I call
got
it the
it.
street.
The
Going back to
street.
the street.
Going
Yeah.
back to the street. But then you say, oh, why is that line different from the other lines? Well, I think it's color, it's thickness, right? And so if you have
Hmm.
three voices that are moving in parallel, they aren't really like three independent contrapuntal actors. It's like a thick paintbrush. It's a thick
Yeah.
line. And there's a let's see, one of my jazz arranging books, I think Bill Russo talks about the thickened line. And I love that idea because um, we can hear it. We
Yeah.
notice it because it does a different job in a texture in terms of foreground and background. We notice the upper limits of that line, the kind of melodic edge, but then there's all of this color that gets dragged along with it. And so whether you want to call it faux bourdon or a thick line, whether you're looking at it in the Renaissance or in the center of a jazz band, there's this sense of heft that comes in the center of a texture that glues things together and that plays a different role than the surrounding texture. And so, is there contrary motion in a passage like that? Well, yeah, because in O Oriens, and typically what I'll do is like if I'm using a faux bourdon kind of device, and for those of you who are not familiar with this, it's really just a third stacked below a fourth in what looks like a first inversion triad chord. So like from the bottom up, that would be E, G, and C in a C major chord in first inversion, although our Renaissance ancestors wouldn't have had any idea what that meant. But you have that pattern where you have the those intervals moving in parallel effectively with each other, sometimes dancing around tritones and other weirdnesses. But I'll have that like a thick line in the center of the texture, and then the contrary motion will be happening in other voices relative to the cluster that are moving in faux bourdon. And I think it's just like you said,
Well,
Cam.
it's
I think it's
cool because you just what you just said too is it's almost like you have a fountain pen and you just turn it a little bit. So now that you're going really thin, and now all of a sudden the line you're drawing becomes really thick in the middle, and it's what gives this like musical calligraphy to the texture. And then again, what you had said makes me think of a conversation we had eons ago on the podcast about becoming obsessive about nomenclature versus trying to figure out what the thing really is, and it's like Floberdone, 3-part, planing, whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. It's this idea then of the line thickening up. And now this part in O Oriens directly, I mean, you got essentially B, I mean, a B and an A, or and a D. So you got a low D, well, low, whatever that is, the baritone D, B above that, and then an A above middle C, kind of like holding as bookends above and below, almost on just pedal tones with this plane going in and through it in the middle three voices. And it's just, and then that sort of melts and you melt that away into just a two voice duet texture
mm-hmm,
that is more of independent line duet between tenor and baritone.
mm-hmm,
And then we have this little reiteration of the oh, 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 that kind of cool articulation there in the O's. And then we
mm-hmm.
hear this beautiful kind of swelling, cascading upwards into these really beautiful harmonies that feels much more modern than things that we've heard before, but it has that contemporary choral feel with beautiful suspensions and cascading harmonies. It's really, really thrilling moment there.
Well, it's an interesting text, right? Because
Yeah.
it's "O day spring, splendor of light eternal, and sun of righteousness, come and enlighten those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death." And so you, in very short order, in a short text, you go all the way up from this like celestial, radiant, infinite brightness kind of image down into the shadow of death.
Right.
And it's all framed by O, which is this kind of like pleading.
Yeah.
And so the text, talk about word painting that came up, I think, in the last episode. But the this shape of the lines have a rising and then a falling quality overall. The shape of the harmonies have kind of like a gaining of brightness and intensity, and then a sinking into some sort of like ruminating darkness. And again, that's nothing particularly clever on my part because word painting is, as old as all the Renaissance source material. But there you go.
But there is a difference too between being simplistic and maybe trite about it,
Mm,
and being subtle about it, and a little bit more abstracted. I think if we're talking about visual art, it's like this hyper realism versus a slight abstraction invites you in. I think your word painting lives in that slightly abstracted realm. Um,
yeah.
the next little moment that I really like that we hear that's a direct kind of call back in time is when we get over to measure 32, 33, which you will hear, those of you listening. We have these solid chords underneath, and the upper three voices have this cascading upwards, da dum be dum, this upwards little motif, I guess. And then
Mm,
they sing it in imitation with each other. So you hear the upper three voices hitting that C5 beats apart from each other. And it has this really cool, dazzling light rising kind of imitative one after the other texture, and that imitation is very much a direct callback as well.
Yeah, illumina. It's like such an
Right.
exciting word.
Yeah. So many like
Yeah.
the liquid consonants and the jumping back and forth between E, which is a bright forward vowel, and Lu, which is the darkest vowel. It's literally the brightest to the darkest vowel. And then we kind of settle in the center on Ah. So illumina. Every consonant is a liquid consonant, so it has pitch
Hmm.
and it has time, and you can really do a lot. And so I think these little bouncing lights that we hear, and then it kind of there's one last moment of this quasi faux and then it kind of falls down into this mortis, and you hear this darker, richer chord on which is death, mortis, and it lands in this open, really open sonority. So, which is not where you're expecting it to go. Talking about expecting to turn right and you turn left is
Mm.
exactly this ending a little bit.
Well, okay, so to maybe comment on that as we're wrapping up, the one of the things that I think is great about common practice harmony is that it kind of establishes this rapport with the listener where
Mm,
somehow we all are in on the joke, right? Because if I go dot 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 dot, everybody in the audience knows that it should go dot dot next, right? That's
right.
like the genius of common practice harmony is that we can take something that's totally abstract, just little vibrations in the air, and the composer can say something and the audience gets it.
Mm.
And it's because we have some shared expectations about one to the five to the one to the five to the one five one five five one five one, right?
Dun, dun, dun,
We do
dun, 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 dun.
we just
Yeah.
we kind of know how the language works, and that's the genius of it. And some of the music I like best, I like it because you can be clever inside of a shared language. If the audience
Mm.
has no idea what language you're speaking, it's actually very hard to be clever because
Your punchline doesn't land at all.
if I come at you and I go beep up, you're like shrug, uh, right? And so
Yeah.
what interests me in this context is saying without leaning really hard onto the template of the 1451 common practice playbook, can I still be clever and can I communicate something to the listeners so that they form expectations and so that their memory of the piece as it's passing causes them to wonder and causes them to guess and causes them to say, "Ooh, I think this is going to turn right." Because
Mm.
if I can do that with them, then when I turn left, it's an interesting for everybody,
Yeah. Yeah. Because you
right?
almost expect, speaking of this passage in particular, it's almost like you kind of expect it to get to some sort of F or B flat or C sonority that's kind
Hmm.
of, it may be slightly more open or have, um, I think it's, I can't remember who wrote the treatise on harmony about the turn of the 20th century. Anyway, talks about open dissonances versus closed dissonances. Maybe an open shimmery dissonance in some sort of quasi major-ish sonority, but it's totally not. It sounds like it's going to be this dominant chord to major, and it's dominant, and then it's like F, A, C, E flat to G, D, G open.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it is wild and amazing. But that E flat that pulls you down to the D natural, and the F just stepping up to a G, you know, and then having no third or anything.
Well, there's
I
two
think
things
it's
going on with this one. One is that, by the time you get to the end of this, you will have spent just over 2 minutes with this piece, right?
yeah.
And the opening parts of it, depending on how you're hearing them, you might hear them kind of as in a D-modal minor
Mm,
context. There's a lot of that, and that kind of tips back to the source material. And so hearing B flats in that context isn't very surprising because it just sounds kind of D minor-ish or whatever.
hmm
But then when it turns the corner at the end, Well, so first we get up into that illumina, that this like bright righteousness kind of shimmery stuff. But then when it starts going back down and you feel the kind of the gravity shifting, what I hope is happening is that you start realizing that that whole long protracted opening sequence of D minor-ish stuff is actually more like a long minor five chord in a way
Yeah.
to what turns out to be the place where we land. What it does is if you're listening actively, and if I'm doing the job of speaking a language that we share a little bit, what we're going to discover is that what we thought was X was actually Y.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel like that's an exciting payoff for a composer because um, I'm not I'm not dwelling in ambiguity or randomness because I'm
Right.
not sure what I'm up to. What I'm trying to do is set the stage so that when you start watching the play, you think you get it, but then at the very last minute, everything rotates 90 degrees and you're like, "Oh, no way, that was cool."
It's like Inception.
Little,
You know,
hey, there we go.
it's like
Oh man.
music Inception.
Yeah.
Should we start
Yeah.
calling you Christopher Nolan Maxfield? Andrew
Uh,
Christopher Nolan Maxfield.
well, I mean, I prefer practical effects, so maybe so that's right.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
so there's a little, in like in a sonnet,
Yeah.
they talk about the volta, that, and in Italian that means the change, right? The turn.
Hmm.
And there's a volta in a sonnet right before the final couplet because the utility of the couplet is not to tell you more of what you've already heard. It's to give you something that causes you to totally reevaluate everything that you've
Yeah.
heard in a new light. And
Man.
when that moment happens and it works, you can feel it because it's just like this little electrical spark. You're like, oh, no way. Like, he
Yeah.
got me. She got
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
The poet, the
It's
playwright,
awesome.
the painter, whoever, they got me. And it's this thrilling experience because it feels great to be surprised and delighted. And so I really believe in a volta that
Mm.
recasts what you've just heard and what you thought you understood in
Yeah.
some new light. And in this case, there's a little twist. You kind of recontextualize everything that you just heard, and it's also designed to tee up the Magnificat that follows it immediately.
Yeah. Uh, well, let's not spend any more time talking about it. Let's listen to it. So here is O Oriens, track number 2 on Wind, Water, Stone, performed by Sound of Ages. Thank you for tuning in to Sound of Ages podcast. Next week, we'll take a deep dive into the next track, which is a surprise. Ooh. On our Wind, Water, Stone album. A reminder that that album drops May 22nd, 2026. So be on the lookout on all streaming platforms, and we will be pressing it to vinyl as well. So we'll have 3 vinyl, all available for purchase, soundofageschoir.com. We'll catch you next time. Thanks.